Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're really getting into something that we all use every day, but maybe don't always think too much about.
Oh, that sounds intriguing. What is it?
It's this idea of cause and effect.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. And like how we figure out that one thing leads to another. It seems pretty basic, right?
Like how we make sense of the world.
Exactly. But when you start thinking about it, especially when we're trying to understand big, complicated things like social programs, well, it gets a lot more challenging. Figuring out what really causes something else, it's not always so straightforward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In a perfect world, we'd have all these perfectly controlled experiments to give us clear answers.
Like those science experiments you see in movies with all the beakers and lab coats and stuff.
Yeah, we call them true experiments. You'd have a control group, and you could carefully manipulate one thing at a time to see the effects.
So, if we wanted to know if a new teaching method helps students learn better, we could randomly assign some kids to the new method and some to the old method, and then compare their scores.
Exactly. Random assignment is key in those true experiments. It helps ensure that the groups are as similar as possible to begin with, so any differences we see are more likely due to the thing we're changing, the teaching method in this case.
Makes sense, but you were saying it's not always a perfect world out there in research land.
It's not. And when we can't do a true experiment for practical or ethical reasons, that's where quasi-experiments come in.
Quasi-experiments, those sound a little mysterious.
They are kind of like detective work. We're still trying to figure out cause and effect, but we don't have all the control we'd like.
So it's like trying to solve a case with some missing clues.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges is making sure we're not tricked by other factors that could be influencing the results.
Tricked. Like, how so?
Well, think about it. Let's say we want to see if a new after-school program helps kids improve their grades. So we find a group of kids who are in the program, and we compare their grades to a group of kids who aren't.
Seems straightforward enough.
But what if the kids in the after-school program also happen to have parents who are really involved in their education?
So their higher grades might not be because of the program itself, but because they're getting extra help at home.
Exactly. That's just one example of what we call a threat to internal validity.
Internal validity. That sounds a bit like a science-y term.
It is, but basically it means we need to be really careful about making sure that the thing we're interested in, the after-school program in this case, is actually what's causing the changes we see and not something else.
I see. So it's like we're trying to rule out all those other possible explanations, those sneaky alternative suspects in our cause and effect case.
Exactly, and there are all sorts of these threats that researchers have to watch out for.
Like what? Give me another example.
Okay, imagine a city implements a new crime prevention program, and they see a drop in crime rates.
Sounds promising.
It does.
Mm.
But what if, at the same time, the economy improves and more jobs become available?
Oh, I see. The drop in crime might not be because of the program, but because people have more opportunities and are less likely to commit crimes in the first place.
Exactly. It's like trying to figure out if it was the new workout routine that helped you lose weight, or if it was also because you started eating healthier at the same time.
So how do researchers even begin to untangle all these messy real-world factors when they're trying to figure out if a program or intervention is actually working?
Well, they have a whole toolkit of strategies. One common approach is to use something called a non-equivalent control group design.
Okay, break that down for me. Non-equivalent control group.
So in a true experiment, we'd have random assignment to make our groups as similar as possible.
Right.
But in a quasi-experiment, we often can't do that. Maybe we're working with existing groups, like different classrooms in a school or different neighborhoods in a city.
So the groups aren't perfectly matched from the start.
Exactly. They're non-equivalent. But even without random assignment, we can still try to find a comparison group that is similar as possible to the group receiving the intervention.
So if we're studying that after-school program, we might try to find another school with similar demographics and academic performance, but where kids aren't getting that extra help.
You got it. And we'd want to collect data on both groups before the program starts.
Like baseline data.
Exactly. That way, we can see if the groups were similar to begin with and track any changes over time.
That makes sense. The more information we have, the better we can piece together the puzzle.
Right. Let's look at a really classic example of this non-equivalent control group design in action. Have you ever heard of the Langer and Rodin study?
Langer and Rodin. Ringing a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
It was a fascinating study done back in 1976, and it really highlights how researchers can get creative with quasi-experimental designs.
Okay, tell me more. I'm all ears.
So, Langer and Rodin were interested in this idea of personal responsibility and how it affects people's well-being, particularly older adults.
Interesting. What did they do?
They worked with a nursing home and focused on two different floors. One floor became what they called the responsibility-induced group.
Okay.
The residents on this floor were given more choices and control over their daily lives.
Like what kinds of choices?
Things like choosing which night to watch a movie, taking care of a plant, or even deciding how they wanted to arrange their furniture.
So they had more say in their own routines.
Exactly. And the other floor was the comparison group. They received the standard level of care, but they didn't have those same opportunities for choice and control.
Okay, so we've got our two groups. Now I'm dying to know what happened.
Well, the results were quite striking. The residents in the responsibility-induced group, the ones who had more control, they showed some really positive changes.
Like what?
They reported feeling happier, more alert, and more active. They were even more likely to participate in activities.
Wow, that's really something. So just giving people a little bit more autonomy can make a big difference.
It seems that way. Now remember, this was a quasi-experiment, so we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. But it's a really compelling illustration of how researchers can study important questions in real-world settings, even when they can't use random assignment.
I'm really starting to see how these quasi-experiments are like detective stories. You've got to carefully examine the evidence, consider all the possible suspects, and try to piece together what really happened.
You've got it. And in our next deep dive, we're going to explore another fascinating quasi-experimental design that's all about tracking changes over time. It's called the interrupted time series design, and it's like having a time machine for research.
A time machine. I'm already intrigued. Can't wait to learn more about that. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to make sure we touch on one more important topic.
What's that?
Program evaluation. It's all about using research methods to figure out how well social programs are actually working.
Yes. Program evaluation. It's where the rubber really meets the road. It's about asking those tough questions. Is this program actually making a difference? Are we achieving our goals? And are we doing it in a way that's cost-effective?
So it's not enough to just have a good idea for a program. We need evidence to show that it's truly making a positive impact.
Exactly. We've got to go beyond those good intentions and really examine the data. And there are 4 key questions that guide program evaluation.
Okay, hit me with those questions. I'm ready to take notes.
The first one is all about figuring out if there's even a need for the program in the first place. It's called a needs assessment.
Right, because if there's no real need, then why are we even bothering with the program?
Exactly. We need to understand the problem we're trying to solve and the specific needs of the population we're aiming to help.
So step 1, figure out if there's a problem that needs solving. What's next?
Once we've established the need and the program is up and running, we've got to make sure it's actually being implemented as planned.
Like, are the services actually reaching the people who need them?
You got it. That's called a process evaluation. Are we following the plan? Are we delivering the program as intended?
Okay, process evaluation, making sure things are running smoothly. What's the third question?
Then comes the big one. Is the program actually achieving its goals? This is outcome evaluation.
This is where we see if those good intentions are actually leading to real, measurable changes.
Right. We need to see evidence that the program is making a positive difference in people's lives. And finally, there's efficiency evaluation.
Efficiency, so that's about making sure we're being smart with our resources.
Exactly. Are we getting the most bang for our buck? Is the program cost effective?
Makes sense. So program evaluation is all about asking those tough questions and using data to drive decision-making.
It is. And it's something that affects all of us because these programs touch so many areas of our lives.
From education to healthcare to social services, we need to make sure that the programs we're investing in are truly making a difference.
Absolutely. And that's why this discussion about quasi-experimental designs is so important. It's giving us the tools to understand how researchers study these real-world programs, even with all those messy complexities we've been talking about.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more informed about how research actually works out there in the real world.
Me too.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to explore. I'm really looking forward to diving into that interrupted time series design in our next part.
Yeah, that time machine idea is really catching my attention. But for now, thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive.
And be sure to come back for part 2. We've got more exciting research adventures ahead. It really is like having that time machine right, being able to just go back and look at all the data and see what happened.
Okay, so let's say like we're looking at those traffic accidents before and after a city lowers the speed limit on some, busy road.
Hmm.
What are we actually looking for in the data to tell us if that like actually worked?
So we want to see like a drop in accidents right after that speed limit changes. It's not going to be a perfect straight line down.
Right.
There's always going to be ups and downs.
Yeah.
But overall, the trend should be decreasing.
Okay, but how do you know that wasn't just caused by something else? Like, what if people were already starting to drive more carefully because there was, like, I don't know, maybe a public safety campaign going on? Or just, like, less traffic in general during that time?
Yeah, you're totally right. We have to think about those alternative explanations, like all
Hmm.
those threats to internal validity we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
They can pop up here too.
Sneaky little thing.
So for example, like history's a big one with a time series design.
Okay.
Like, what if, just by chance, a new traffic light got put in at a dangerous intersection around the same time they changed the speed limit?
Oh, yeah.
That could also explain a decrease in accidents.
So how do researchers figure out if it was, like, the speed limit or the new traffic light or, whatever else might have been going on?
So one way is to add a comparison group,
Okay.
just like we were talking about with the non-equivalent control group design.
Right.
So in our speed limit example, you might compare accident rates on that busy road to rates on similar roads in other cities that, didn't change their speed limits.
Oh, okay, okay. So you're like controlling for those bigger trends that might be affecting both cities.
Exactly.
So if you see a drop in accidents only on the road with the new speed limit, well, that gives you a little bit more confidence that it was actually the speed limit that made the difference.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes researchers will get even more creative. Like instead of comparing different cities, they might compare different days of the week.
Ooh.
So
Okay.
like maybe they see that accidents decreased on weekdays after the speed limit change, but not on weekends when people tend to drive differently anyway.
Interesting. So it's all about finding those clever ways to rule out those other explanations, those sneaky little alternative suspects.
It really is.
Yeah.
But even with a comparison group and all this detective work, can we ever be 100% sure that it was the policy change, like the speed limit, that actually caused the change?
Right, right. It's a good question.
That's the thing about quasi-experimental designs.
Right.
We can get closer to the truth, but absolute certainty is tough. There's always the possibility that some other, unknown factor could be in play.
So it's more about like weighing the evidence, right?
Yeah.
Looking at all the different explanations and figuring out which one makes the most sense based on what you know.
Right, and that's why it's important for researchers to be really upfront about the limitations of their studies.
Yeah.
Good researchers will acknowledge the uncertainties and not, overstate their conclusions.
Humility, it's a virtue, especially for a researcher, it sounds like.
It is. We've been focusing a lot on these specific research designs,
Hmm.
but I think it's also important to kind of step back and think about the bigger picture, especially when it comes to things like program evaluation.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about those 4 key evaluation questions like needs assessment, process evaluation, outcome evaluation, and efficiency evaluation.
Right.
Those are really important, but in the real world, things don't always fit neatly into those categories.
They don't. Think about the politics of evaluation, for example.
Okay.
Sometimes organizations or even policymakers might be a little bit reluctant to embrace, really rigorous evaluation.
That's interesting. Why would anyone resist finding out if a program is actually working? Like, wouldn't you want to know if you're making a positive difference?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes there can be political pressures
Mm-hmm.
or funding concerns or even just a fear of, admitting that maybe something isn't working as well as we hoped.
Oh, I see. So it's tough to face that reality sometimes.
It can be. And there's also sometimes this sense of, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
The program seems to be running smoothly, so why rock the boat? But without a proper evaluation, we might never know if we could be doing things even better.
Or even worse, we might be wasting a lot of time and money and effort on programs that aren't really helping anyone.
That's right. It's about being accountable to the people we're trying to serve,
Right.
using the evidence to make good decisions,
Yeah.
and just making sure we're using our resources wisely.
It's like that old saying, measure twice, cut once. But in this case, it's more like evaluate thoroughly, implement wisely.
Exactly. And this brings to mind a classic example. Have you ever heard of the Scared Straight program?
Oh, yeah, scared straight. That was like a big thing back in the day, right?
It was. The idea was to take at-risk youth, kids who were maybe getting into some trouble,
Mm-hmm.
and expose them to the harsh realities of prison life, kind of like a wake-up call.
Right, like scare them straight, hence the name.
Exactly. And initially, it got a lot of positive attention.
Yeah.
There were these anecdotes, these stories about kids who seemed to turn their lives around after going through the program.
Yeah, it seemed like a pretty intuitive idea, you know? Like, who wouldn't be scared straight after seeing what prison is really like?
Right, and the problem is, when researchers actually started to evaluate the program rigorously, the results were a lot more complicated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some studies even suggested that in some cases, the program might have actually been increasing criminal behavior.
Whoa, that's a pretty big unintended consequence. So even when something seems like common sense, we can't just assume it's going to work.
Exactly. We really need that solid research to guide us.
It's like our intuition can sometimes lead us astray. We need that evidence to show us the way.
We do. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be, critical consumers of information. When we hear about a program that sounds amazing, we need to ask ourselves, what's the evidence?
Mm-hmm.
Has this program been rigorously evaluated?
So it's about looking beyond the headlines and the feel-good stories and really digging into the research.
It is, and sometimes that means being okay with uncertainty, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers.
Right. It's about embracing the unknown, but always striving to learn more.
Exactly. And speaking of learning more, I think it's a good time to bring our listeners back into the conversation. What are you all thinking about? What are you finding most interesting or surprising about this deep dive so far?
Yeah. What's resonating with you? What questions are popping up?
Because ultimately the goal here isn't just to fill your head with facts about research methods,
Right.
but to give you the tools to think critically about the information you encounter every day.
It's about empowering you to be an informed citizen, to ask those tough questions, and to advocate for policies and programs that are actually backed by evidence.
And remember that thought-provoking question from the textbook author.
About embracing a more experimental approach to social reform.
Yeah, that one. What are your thoughts on that? What are the potential benefits and drawbacks of being more experimental in the way we try to solve social problems?
It's a big question for sure.
It is. And it's one that deserves careful consideration.
So, as we head into the final part of our deep dive, keep that question in mind. Do we have the courage to embrace a more experimental mindset, to test our assumptions, and to learn from both our successes and our failures?
It's something to ponder. Stick with us.
Yeah, it is a really big question, isn't it? Like, should we be more experimental with how we're trying to tackle all these social problems? It does kind of sound a little radical, but the more we talk about it, the more I'm seeing how it makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of thinking for sure. But think about it. We already do this kind of experimental approach in other fields, right? Like look at medicine.
Okay.
We don't just release brand new drugs without testing them super carefully to make sure they're safe and that they actually work. We've got clinical trials and, control groups and all of that. Why not apply that same rigor to social interventions as well?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we're talking about things that affect people's lives just as much as new drugs, if not more.
Exactly. Think about things like education reforms or programs to reduce poverty or criminal justice initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
We're always trying new approaches in these areas,
Yeah.
but we don't always have those super clear ways to measure whether they're actually having a positive impact or not.
So we could be putting a ton of resources into these programs that sound good on paper, but aren't actually making things better.
Yeah, or even worse, they could be unintentionally making things worse in some cases. A more experimental approach could help avoid those kinds of situations.
Right. But of course, it's not as simple as saying, let's just experiment on society. I mean, there are these ethical lines we have to be really careful not to cross, right?
Oh, absolutely. We can't just treat people like guinea pigs.
Right.
One of the biggest challenges is ensuring informed consent.
Yeah. In a medical trial, people know that they're part of a research study and they can choose whether or not they want to participate.
Right.
But with these big social programs, that gets a lot more complicated.
It does. And then there's always the risk of those unintended consequences.
Yeah, like those ripple effects. It's like throwing a pebble into a pond. You never quite know how far those waves are going to spread.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about just being reckless and experimenting for the sake of experimenting.
Right.
It's about acknowledging how complex these issues are and being willing to change course when we need to.
So finding that balance between being innovative and trying new things, but also being responsible and really thinking through all those potential
Yeah,
consequences.
it's a conversation we need to have as a society.
Yeah.
What level of experimentation are we okay with? What safeguards do we need to put in place? How do we make sure this benefits everyone?
It's a lot to consider, but I think the fact that we're even having this conversation shows how much our understanding of research has grown and how much potential it has to shape the world for the better.
Yeah. So what are we taking away from all this?
Well, hopefully our listeners are walking away with a lot more than just facts about research methods.
Right.
I hope they're also feeling empowered to ask those hard questions, to dig into the evidence, and to really be involved in creating a better world.
And that better world will hopefully be built on solid research, not just assumptions and good intentions.
Exactly. Remember, everyone, the quest for knowledge never really ends. Keep asking those questions. Keep diving deep into the topics that matter to you.
And don't be afraid to get a little messy along the way. Real-world research is rarely neat and tidy.
It's more like an adventure.
Exactly.
So until next time.
Happy researching, everyone.